None of us parents want our children to be traumatized, right? But have you noticed that trauma is one of these labels that gets thrown around all the time these days? I want to introduce you to Abigail Shrier, who you may already know. She's a best-selling journalist and has written 2 brilliant books, including Irreversible Damage and now Bad Therapy. In her book, Bad Therapy, she outlines how trauma has become this ubiquitous word that parents just throw around and slap on any unpreferred life event. Anytime that children actually face something that's a bit uncomfortable or they dislike, it is now seen as a trauma. And how many of you have said yourself or heard your friends say, well, we'll just have to save up for therapy for my kids so that they can deal with all the trauma that I'm putting them through as a parent? Listen, my friends, this is something we have to stop in its tracks, and I'm going to outline exactly why and how in today's video. Hi, welcome back to Hi Fam. I'm Avital. I'm here to help you to build a strong family culture and raise resilient kids. And we can't raise resilient kids if they are constantly being harassed and labeled as traumatized. Listen, I speak as someone who has overcome pretty severe clinical PTSD, so I don't want to minimize or, erase the fact that trauma and PTSD does exist. But by the end of this video, you're going to understand why I think it's a really bad idea for us to continuously be throwing that word around or seeing our kids as potentially traumatized by life's events. So it used to be that we would divide trauma into big T trauma and little t trauma. Big T trauma were those severe life experiences that really left someone wounded or, shocked, right? And that's what trauma literally means, is a shock to the system. And if you have PTSD, it's a shock to the system that remains and lingers with psychological side effects. This could be something like a natural disaster, like witnessing violence or death, like going through a serious accident, or like being in combat or experiencing physical or sexual assault. These are kind of very big, rattling life events that can scar us psychologically somewhat and leave lingering symptoms like, in my case, I had night terrors, hallucinations, and panic attacks. And those are the types of things that are pretty typical, those flashbacks and those, kind of getting very, very frozen in the moment and unable to respond, that can be typical of people like war vets or people who are survivors of sexual abuse. That's how we used to see trauma. There was a defined and understandable event that led to this psychological response. But today, we relate to trauma in a much broader perspective. This is that little t trauma. And these are life events that are really difficult and challenging, the adversity that many people face. It could be something like someone having chronic illness in the family, ongoing bullying. It could be something like conflict in the family or divorce. The types of things that are difficult for us to experience, that are painful experiences, and that are often much lower grade in their intensity, but perhaps ongoing, and they have this kind of cumulative effect. But here's where we start to go overboard. Us parents, especially in that gentle, respectful, peaceful parenting world, are often using the word trauma to describe any uncomfortable experience, any time where it was painful, anytime someone teased or told us off, or we didn't get what we want, or we didn't make the cut, or even we just failed. And this is where we have to really kind of take back the reins and notice what type of fragility we are projecting onto our children. It is perfectly normal and perhaps even healthy for our children to face challenges, adversity, and stress. When children face a fail on a test, when children face teasing at school, when they get left out or they don't get invited to the party, when they trip and fall and scrape their knee, when they have to miss the season because they sprained their ankle. These are not traumas, and they shouldn't be labeled as such. These are regular childhood challenges. And they are the exact places where our children get to toughen themselves up a bit, which is good for them. If we parents continuously slap the label trauma on everything, as we so often do, we are projecting onto our child a weakness, a fragility, an inability to cope with the regular disappointments, frustrations, and irritations of day-to-day life. The fact that other people can sometimes be jerks. The fact that life sometimes doesn't hand us what we want. The fact that sometimes I can't afford something, or the weather wasn't favorable to our activity, or that our siblings get something that we wanted, or that we have to wait, or that we're disappointed, or that we're frustrated, or that our feelings are hurt. Having your feelings hurt, being disrespected, not getting what you want, having to delay your gratification, none of these are traumas. And they must not be treated as such. The standards of gentle parenting have come to a place where so many of my students come to me and say, I'm afraid I'm traumatizing my child. And I think to myself, my goodness, what kind of abuse are you visiting upon them? What have you done to this poor child to traumatize them? What kind of horrific scenes are you exposing them to? And then, inevitably, the parent shares with me that they raised their voice, that they've been bribing, that they've punished their child or sent them to a timeout, that they told their child, good girl, and used too much praise. Friends, we're starting to sound ridiculous. We're starting to sound like we've lost the plot, and we're starting to sound like we have zero perspective on what real adversity looks like and what real trauma constitutes. No, these things are not traumatic. And no, you are not traumatizing your child, even when you raise your voice, even when you tell them you're disappointed or ashamed in them, even when you punish them and send them to their room. These are not traumas. This does not constitute abuse. Being told to stop crying, being sleep trained, being left with a babysitter so mom can get a break. None of these are traumas. And we must stop using that frame of thinking, and here is why. Number one, I've already said, it weakens our children. When you see a child as weak, when you see something like me going on a mini vacation with my husband and leaving my kids alone for a couple of days with grandma as a trauma, what I'm communicating to that child is, you're so weak, you can't even handle 48 hours in the loving embrace of your grandma. Why would I communicate that type of weakness to my child? Don't we know that what we speak into our children, the way that we reflect back to them, the mirror that we hold up to them is how they develop their own self-concept, how they see themselves? You want to see your child as weak, your child will see themselves as weak, and believe me, they'll be weak. Right? And we see this with young adults today, how they've been shown that they're incapable, that they're incompetent, that they're highly sensitive, that they're strong-willed, that they have some kind of special label that shows how difficult life is for them. That's not a good thing. That's really weakening our children. That's not doing them any favors whatsoever. You want to raise a strong child, a capable child, a child who has been told, yes, you can handle it. You'll figure it out. I'm sure you've got this. So you didn't like it. Never mind. It will pass. A child who is able to move on from, all of the offense that they took. A child who is able to let go of disappointments. A child who is able to learn from failures. Not a child who gets stuck and bemoans and indulges in this kind of navel-gazing and regurgitating of every hurt that they've ever experienced. Don't raise a child who thinks that everything is too hard for them, that they can't handle anything. Number two, it hurts the children who are truly hurting. Some children suffer real trauma. Some children go through truly terribly adverse childhood experiences, and they really need that label to be kept pristine and precise. They need that label to be kept for the true traumatic experiences and not just broadened to a place where it means anything I didn't like. There is a categorical difference between a child who is bounced around from foster home to foster home, between a child who has witnessed violence or death, between a child who has gone through tragedy and a child whose parents yell sometimes. We can't treat them as the same. That isn't fair on the child who's going through actual trauma. There is a time and a place for true therapy and sensitivity and awareness of PTSD symptoms, etc. But that's not in regular day-to-day life and normal challenges and, just roughing up against the facts of life. That's not where it is. And so it's unfair and unwise as a society to allow this concept to creep so far that we can't differentiate between grief and tragedy and discomfort and disappointment. Someone once told me not so long ago that there is no hierarchy to grief, that one person might be mourning their cat, and another person might be mourning 6 people in their family being brutally murdered in front of their eyes, and there's no hierarchy. We all just kind of feel grief in our own way. I don't buy this relativism. I don't think it's good for us. I don't think it's good for our children. And I think, honestly, we all kind of sense that that's somewhat BS. Like, yep, someone losing their cat might be really sad that they lost their pet, but it's also a very normal and natural way of events, right? We know that this is coming. We know that that's the kind of order of nature and the way the world works. There's nothing out of the ordinary or shocking, right? Or traumatic about that event. It might be sad, you might be sad about it, and that would be really appropriate. There would be something wrong with you if you weren't sad when you lose your pet, but it's not a trauma. Someone having their whole family brutally murdered in front of them is, and it must be treated differently. We must respect the hierarchy of different levels of tragedy, grief, and trauma in order to be able to treat them properly. And that is because treatment bears risk. Yeah, treatment bears risk. This is another thing that is brilliantly outlined in the book Bad Therapy. Again, I highly recommend it. I'll link it below. This concept is something I learned from this book, which is called iatrogenesis, which is when the healer harms, right? When the therapist or the doctor actually causes harm. When you treat someone who doesn't have trauma as though they do, you are causing harm. You are embedding in their head that they are somehow damaged and broken, that they are going to experience all sorts of symptoms. And of course, we're highly suggestible creatures, and we often live up to those prophecies. And that leads me to point number 3, why you must not label trauma for day-to-day things, which is that it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you tell someone they've been traumatized, they're going to believe you, especially if they're young children. They're not going to be able to say, no, I'm fine, I can handle this, it's okay. They're not going to be able to appeal to their resilience, to their competency, to their strength, because they've been told that they were somehow unfairly hurt, that they are a victim, that they have suffered something terrible and tragic, that they should be struck by grief or by shock, that they should be frozen in place and unable to actually function, that they should be paralyzed with fear or regret or guilt or sadness and grief. They feel like something has happened to them because you've told them so. Many parents make the joke that their kids are going to need therapy to overcome their own parenting. And this is because we've been sold this idea that somehow we are so damaging in our parenting. If we say the wrong compliment, if we praise in the wrong way, if we use the wrong phrase, if we tell them not to cry, if we raise our voice, if we throw something on the floor because we're just so annoyed at this point, then that is terrible. That child is now traumatized. Big T. No, let's all just take a deep breath in and remember that children are anti-fragile. That means that they actually grow from a little bit of stress. Remember, fragile things break under stress, like glass. Non-fragile things like steel can handle a lot of stress. And anti-fragile things like muscles get stronger under stress. Listen, my friend, I'm not going to advocate for you yelling, but if you do yell, then that's a little bit of stress in the household, and our children grow stronger from that. You can apologize, you can try to calm yourself down, but you do not need to diagnose trauma as a result. And you don't need to excuse bad behavior in your children because you're such a terrible parent and you've just damaged them somehow. No, for generation upon generation, children have handled, maybe less than perfect, less than idyllic parents who everyone has their own baggage, and they've come out okay. And it does not need to be labeled as a trauma or compared to some of life's truly tragic events. But here's the most important reason that you shouldn't label your kids as traumatized by daily life events. And that's because even in the most tragic circumstances, even in objectively traumatic situations, like a disaster, like a war, most people live through the traumatic event, but they are not traumatized. What do I mean by that? I mean that most people are part of that traumatic event, but they recover spontaneously and naturally. Most people have resilience. Only a small percentage, something akin to about 10% of the people who go through the traumatic event have recurring and consistent symptoms later on. Most people do not have PTSD. I mean, you would think that most people that witness, the Twin Towers, or that live through October 7th, or that have been through one of the Katrina, that they would be traumatized. But the truth is that even though they went through a traumatic event, they don't have lingering PTSD symptoms. Those symptoms, they actually get cured by human resilience in a natural way. And in fact, many of them will find that living through that traumatic event made them stronger, not weaker. And that's because what doesn't kill us typically makes us stronger. What doesn't kill us actually does bring with it that gift of building up our inner resilience and our strength. Again, I'm speaking as someone who has recovered somewhat from a pretty severe PTSD. I was one of those weaker individuals in a way, or affected in that way, whether it's my genes or my age or whatever it was, that for me, the PTSD absolutely lingered and absolutely expressed itself in pretty severe symptoms for many years. And I say still, even if you've been through a big T trauma, you can grow stronger from that, not weaker. Being traumatized is not the worst thing that happens to people. And yeah, you might need therapy, you might need help with that. But even in those cases, we don't need to see those people as weak or as fragile. So that is true tenfold for our own children who are growing up with normal circumstances, with normal conflicts, with normal teasing and disappointments and frustrations. We absolutely should never see those as events that could break them. See your child as anti-fragile. See their challenges as making them stronger, not weaker. When my children face a disappointment, I think to myself, good, yes, handle disappointment, face disappointment, deal with disappointment. Be like, disappointment, come get me. I got you, I'm fine, I can handle this. When my children are left out, of course it stabs me in my heart. Of course I feel sad for a moment, but then I say, you know what, good. That's part of life. Some people aren't going to like you. Some people aren't going to include you. So I'm not going to rush to call the friends and to make sure that they get invited. No, I'm going to say, handle it. Yeah, it hurts, it stings. So what? Brush it off, you can take it. It's okay. Learn a lesson from it. You include others. When my children get physically hurt, they stub their toe, they scrape their knee, they twist their ankle, I say, okay, life has pain, buddy. I'm sorry, I feel you. It hurts me. I want to protect them. I want to wrap them in bubble wrap. But no, you can handle it. Breathe, embrace the pain, let it pass, and it will pass. And you'll learn that pain isn't the worst thing, that you can handle pain. At the very least, you'll learn that pain is part of life and that you kind of have no choice but to handle it. Let's raise strong children. And the best way to start raising a strong and resilient child is to build a strong and resilient family culture. How do you do that? Well, that is what I will guide you through inside of the studio, my annual membership. The studio takes you piece by piece on this leadership curriculum where it teaches you how to lead a family that is built on your values. A family that is going to really instill those values in your child and make sure that you don't just leave it up to the world, because the world right now is going to be telling your child that they're fragile, that they're weak, that they're traumatized, that they can't, that they just need a lot of therapy and then everything might be okay, maybe one day. But you're going to give them a different message. You're going to give them the message of capability, of competency, of a strong backbone, of broad shoulders, of a big smile, because you're going to create a strong family culture. So I warmly invite you to check out the studio at highfam.com/studio. Check it out. I would love for you to join me when the doors open. And meanwhile, if you found this interesting, share it with a friend and use it to start a conversation, and let me know which point was most interesting for you in the comments below. Keep on living that high fam life, and I'll see you in the next video.